Welcome to this explainer. Today, we're going on a bit of a historical detective mission. We are going to explore a really compelling argument that aims to recover the ancient native logic of biblical atonement. And we're going to do that by stripping away centuries of medieval political and legal overlays that have been basically layered right on top of it. It's a completely mind-bending journey that reveals just how much our modern beliefs are shaped by the specific political eras we happen to live in.
So, let me just ask you a question. Are the ways you view ancient sacred texts actually the product of an 11th century feudal political system? I know, it sounds wild, right? But as we dig into the source material today, we are going to see how the legal architecture of medieval Europe might have fundamentally rewritten the way the Western world actually understands the ancient mechanics of the cross.
Okay, let's dive into this roadmap. We'll quickly hit the Atonement Crisis, travel through the Feudal Honor System, explore the Roman courtroom shift, uncover the ancient Hebraic reality, look at blood as a detergent, and finally wrap up with a restored cosmic narrative. Let's get to it.
Section 1. The Atonement Crisis.
For nearly a millennium, Western theology has intensely debated exactly how the cross works. Different eras have produced incredibly complex, formal theories to try and explain it, and that brings us to the core of our explainer today. We're looking at the fascinating research of Marc Bates, specifically from his paper titled Recovering the Hebraic Logic of Substitutionary Atonement. Bates argues that for centuries, post-biblical theologians have unknowingly projected much later Western legal frameworks onto a much older, sanctuary-centered text. Essentially, he's suggesting that we've been trying to solve an ancient Middle Eastern puzzle using the rulebook of European law.
To really get a grip on how this happened, we have to map out our journey chronologically. Bates points out that the apologetics consistently mirrors the socio-legal architecture of its specific historical era. Just notice the massive historical gaps here. The original texts were written in the ancient Near East context, around 1000 BCE and the 1st century CE. But the major theoretical lenses we still use to read them today? Well, those were forged much later. First in 1098 CE during the Feudal Europe era, and then updated again in the 1500s during the European Reformation.
Section 2. The Feudal Honor System.
This brings us to our first major historical plot twist, and it's guided by an 11th century theologian named Anselm of Canterbury. Back in 1098, Anselm wrote a massive treatise that totally reframed theology using the categories of medieval feudal law. You kind of have to put yourself in Anselm's shoes and imagine his world, a world of medieval feudal vassalage. In a feudal society, if you commit an offense, the severity of that crime is measured by the social status of the person you offended. Therefore, human sin against an infinitely exalted Lord was suddenly viewed as a theft of God's objective honor. That created an infinite debt. In feudal law, a lord could resolve an offense through what was called satisfaction, a voluntary payment of compensation that essentially restored his honor. So, following Bates's analysis, here is Anselm's ultimate feudal fix. Because humanity owed an infinite debt of honor, but only God could actually pay something of infinite value, the God-man offered his sinless life as a voluntary gift. This superabundant satisfaction successfully restored divine honor. And here is the absolutely crucial, mind-blowing point about Anselm's model. This gift legally averted punishment altogether. In this strict feudal framework, Christ wasn't actually punished by the Father. Instead, he offered a gift of honor that rendered punishment totally unnecessary. The theology perfectly mirrored the political reality of the medieval manner.
Section 3. The Roman courtroom shift.
But, the laws of Europe obviously didn't stay feudal forever. During the Reformation, society centralized. European cultures moved away from localized feudal lords and began adopting these strict statutory, state-administrated models that were heavily influenced by Roman criminal law. According to the research, John Calvin and other reformers essentially updated Anselm's architecture to fit this brand new juridical climate. In Roman statutory law, justice is all about public retributive punishment, not just restoring a lord's private honor. God was now viewed primarily as a just judge who is absolutely bound by absolute law.
If we contrast these two frameworks, you can really see how the overlay changes. Under feudal vassalage, the core problem is the theft of God's objective honor, but shift over to Roman statutory law, and the problem suddenly becomes the transgression of absolute legal justice. Because God is now seen as a judge bound by absolute law, he couldn't just accept a gift of honor anymore. The legal penalty literally had to be paid. This shift is exactly what birthed the penal substitution model, where Jesus acts as a forensic substitute, meaning he legally takes on the criminal guilt and absorbs the punitive wrath of the judge.
Now, what's really interesting here is when we summarize this whole paradigm shift with Bates's research.
It's fascinating how perfectly the Anselmian and Reformed concepts map right onto their specific European eras. But wait, what about the ancient Hebraic paradigm? That operates in an entirely different universe. It's definitely not a medieval manor, and it's for sure not a Roman courtroom. The socio-legal context is actually an ancient Near Eastern cosmic temple. Bates makes the argument that while these Western models are highly effective at teaching the gravity of guilt, they are ultimately secondary juridical overlays placed on top of a very different, much more ancient reality.
Section 4. The Ancient Hebraic Reality.
So let's just completely strip away the medieval knights and the Renaissance judges for a second. What was the actual native cognitive environment of the ancient Israelites? To figure this out, we have to consider Leviticus 17:11, which says, "For the life of the flesh is in the blood, and I have given it for you upon the altar to make atonement for your souls." Now, in the Western legal frameworks we were just talking about, the blood of an animal is almost always viewed as a penalty paid, a life taken to satisfy a judge's wrath. But in the ancient Near East, blood actually functioned as a highly specific ritual mechanism.
Section 5. Blood as a detergent.
To really wrap our heads around this, we need to step entirely out of the courtroom and step inside the ancient cosmic sanctuary. Bates points to the research of scholar Jacob Milgram, who notes that the Hebrew word translated as atonement, which is Kippur, actually comes from a Semitic root meaning to wipe clean or decontaminate. In its native ancient context, Kippur wasn't about paying a legal fine at all. It was strictly about purging and decontaminating sacred space. This makes sense because the ancient Israelites just understood sin very differently than we do today. It wasn't merely a mark on some legal ledger. Sin and impurity generated a tangible, moral miasma. You can think of it like an airborne spiritual pollution. Every single time the people rebelled, this toxic smog adhered to the furniture of the tabernacle, actively polluting the sacred space. If this pollution was allowed to accumulate unchecked, it would literally drive the holy presence of Yahweh away from the camp, leaving the people entirely vulnerable to the chaos.
Let's move to and see how this builds, especially during the Day of Atonement, or Yom Kippur. It's a very specific sequence. First, they slaughter the unblemished victim, but crucially, not to punish it, but to release its unpolluted lifeblood. Second, the high priest carries that lifeblood inside the sanctuary. And third, he applies the blood to the mercy seat. The blood essentially acted as a ritual detergent. It wiped the physical sanctuary clean from the accumulated human pollution, which is what allowed a holy God to remain dwelling among an imperfect people.
Section 6. A restored cosmic narrative.
This ancient logic actually totally changes how we read the grand story of the text. In fact, it solves a massive historical puzzle. If you look at the book of Acts, long after his conversion, the Apostle Paul actually pays for and participates in animal sacrifices at the Jerusalem temple. Now, if Christ's death was a purely legal transaction that instantly terminated all sacrifices, Paul's actions here make zero sense. To a modern reader, it looks like Paul completely lost the memo. But Bates explains the two tiers of play here. Animal blood was strictly for temporal cultic maintenance, purifying the physical earthly temple so people could safely enter the space. But eternal eschatological justification, meaning the permanent cleansing of the human conscience, well, that was always reserved for the ultimate self-offering of the Messiah. So, Paul wasn't confused at all. He was just participating in local temporal maintenance while placing his trust in Christ for eternal justification.
Bates argues that when you use this specific sanctuary cleansing framework, it integrates perfectly into what theologian Walter C. Kaiser Jr. calls the promised plan of God. It's no longer a disjointed series of legal eras, but one continuous, organic trajectory. It starts with the Edenic rebellion, moves right to the Abrahamic promise, establishes the Sinaitic sanctuary, sets up the Davidic lineage, looks ahead to the New Covenant where the law is written on the heart, and finally culminates in a massive cosmic restoration. It's what theologians call a non-supersessionist view, meaning it doesn't replace the continuous story of Israel. Instead, it expands it to include the nations, all through a Messiah who acts as the ultimate high priest, cleansing the cosmic temple once and for all.
Well, this explainer has certainly taken us on a journey, from the feudal manners of 11th century Europe right into the beating heart of the ancient Israelite sanctuary. The research presented by Marc Bates really suggests that our most deeply held theological models are heavily influenced by the specific socio-legal politics of forgotten eras. And it leaves us with a pretty provocative thought to chew on. If we are finally willing to take off our medieval glasses and step out of the Roman courtroom, what other ancient truths might we finally be able to see clearly in their original vibrant colors? Thanks so much for exploring this fascinating historical puzzle with me today.